Hey everybody, welcome back to another installment of what I've been listening to for November of 2021. Each month I take 20 to 25 completely random albums that I haven't heard before, and I listen to them, talk a bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and give each one a score on a scale of 1 to 10. So let me show you the list for this month and then we will dive right into it. Okay, we will start out with the second studio album by singer, composer, and multi-instrumentalist Annie Clark, who goes by the name Saint Vincent. And this is from 2009. It's titled Actor. And this is actually my first Saint Vincent album. I've always heard of her, but never checked her out. And a few weeks back, I was listening to an interview with Scott Walker, and he was asked what modern music that he listens to, and he named three people. He said Radiohead, Tame Impala, and Saint Vincent. So naturally, that piqued my interest in her, and I really wanted to check her out. And I thought this album was great. The music is sort of cloaked in a pop aesthetic, but each song is different and unique in itself, and the writing does take some very adventurous and interesting directions. The influence to this album was heavily derived from scores to Disney films and Woody Allen movies, and she would compose by writing music for different movie scenes with the sound off. So there's definitely an element to this album that has a lot of that magical Disney-like sort of sound, but at the same time there is a chunk of tracks on here that also take on more of a heavy power pop sort of vibe with tracks like Actor Out of Work and Marrow. I thought the production was incredible. I really loved the instrumentation with the woodwinds and the French horn, creating so many beautiful textures. And I really enjoyed Annie Clark's compositional style. I think she has a really great sense of melody and a very adventurous and intriguing sense of harmony, which I always love to hear. And my only critiques would be that there were a couple of tracks on here that I wasn't crazy about stylistically, but I think the overwhelming majority of the songs on here are incredibly strong. My three favorites are The Bed, The Party, and The Neighbors. So, very good album. I will definitely be checking out more St. Vincent. I will give this one an 8.5. Okay, next we have Tom Waits' eighth studio album from 1983 titled Swordfish Trombones. Believe it or not, I've never heard anything by Tom Waits before. I know that might be shocking to some people, but he's been one of those guys that I've heard about my entire life, but I've never explored any of his music. So I looked through his discography and I saw that he had started to take a more experimental turn in the 80s, starting off with this album, which I felt like would probably resonate with me more, so I started out with this one. And I enjoyed it. It was definitely a trip, to say the least. Musically and stylistically, this album is all over the place, taking so many different twists and turns. And when I initially put it on, I had known that Tom Waits could have a raspy voice. And when the first track came on and his vocals entered, there definitely was a part of me that was a little worried that I wouldn't be able to handle his voice for the entire album in that sort of raspy tone. But then as the album continued, I was relieved to find out that he does change his voice a lot, and the raspiness does vary from track to track. I don't mind the raspiness of his voice from time to time, but I just didn't know if I would be able to handle an entire album with just that style of singing, but that didn't end up being the case, so that wasn't an issue. From one track to the next, it was really impossible to anticipate where the album was going, with such a wide range of styles going from dirty rock sounds into jazz, into blues, into avant-garde, and everything in between that. I really loved the writing between the different instruments, particularly the way that they utilized the marimba. That was one sound that I think was a key ingredient to this album, and the way that they combined it with the different instruments was very tasteful. I wouldn't say that I loved every single track on here. There were some moments from time to time that I found challenging, but I do really appreciate the adventurous writing and Tom Waits' ability to combine all of these different influences in the way that he does. My three favorite songs on here are In the Neighborhood, Soldier's Things, and Johnsburg, Illinois. And maybe if I listen to this album more and more, it will continue to grow on me. But like I said, there are some parts of this album that are a bit challenging for me, and I don't love every single track on here. But at the same time, I think there are a lot of really cool moments and some really beautiful songs as well. So, not a bad album. I will give this a 7.5. Alright, now we have the debut studio album by English singer and composer Imogen Heap from 1998 titled I, Megaphone. I'm a huge fan of Imogen Heap, but this is an album that I have never checked out in its entirety. I've always been meaning to get around to it, and I thought it was great. I thought it was a very strong first release. I wouldn't say that I like it as much as Speak for Yourself, but at the same time, it has a very good batch of songs that contain all of the qualities that I love about Imogen Heap, between her beautiful vocal work, her amazing sense of melody and harmony, as well as her unique production style and great sensibilities for using electronics, and her beautiful piano playing as well, which we get to hear more on this album, which is one thing that I really liked about it. This album is much more rock than the ones that will follow it, with much less emphasis on the electronics. And in a lot of ways, it's much more like something that you would hear in a similar vein to like Alanis Morissette or Fiona Apple, but at the same time, it still does have those sensitivities that make it unique to the Imogen Heap sound. I have very similar feelings to this album that I did with the St. Vincent album, where it did have a couple of tracks that I wasn't crazy about, but all of the tracks on here that I liked, like I really liked them. My favorite has got to be Shine, but a couple of other really standout tracks for me are Come Here Boy, Candlelight, and Sleep, which is a beautiful ballad that wraps up the album in such a nice way. I love the lyrics on this song. Her writing evokes so much beautiful imagery, and it just ends the album on such a nice, peaceful note. I did a cover of the song Sleep on my channel last week, so if you're interested, be sure to check that out. But very good album, and for a first release, I think it's great. I will give this an 8.5. Next, we have the debut studio album by American pop group The Walker Brothers from 1965, titled Take It Easy with the Walker Brothers. I've been going pretty deep into Scott Walker's discography, so naturally I'm going to have to check out the Walker Brothers at some point. And I thought this album was for the most part good, but I wouldn't say that I enjoyed it as much as a solo Scott Walker record. And it did have a couple of songs on here that were sort of like skip over tracks for me. It opens up very strong with Make It Easy on Yourself, a beautiful song written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David, and one of the Walker Brothers' most famous hits of all time. And to me, this opening track is the best part of the album. It's by far my favorite song on here. And as the album continues, we have more covers, with a couple of songs on each side that I do enjoy, such as First Love Never Dies, The Girl I Lost in the Rain, I Don't Want to Hear It Anymore, and You're All Around Me, which is a beautiful track and the only original that Scott Walker wrote for this album. So I don't love every song on here, but it does have some really cool moments. I love the production from John Franz. It has that Phil Spector wall of sound, and I think that works so nicely with this sort of group. And even on the songs that I don't care for, it's still always such a treat to be able to hear Scott Walker sing. He's got such a beautiful and distinct voice, and just hearing his voice on a song can make the song better. So, good album, but I wouldn't say that it's amazing. I will give this one a 7. Okay, next we have the fourth studio album by Kate Bush from 1982, titled The Dreaming. I really enjoyed this one. This is the first album that Kate Bush produced entirely on her own, which freed her up to experiment a lot more in the studio, and I think because of that, we got some really unique things from this album. I will say that it did take a few listens for this album to really grow on me, but I do think that these are the kinds of songs that do require a few listens and do get better the more time you spend with them. The songs have this really interesting blend stylistically between pop, experimental, and folk, combined with a lot more changes in time signatures, multiple different uses of synthesizers, unique vocal samples, as well as a wide variety of exotic instruments such as the didgeridoo, the fiddle, bouzouki, mandolin, and the synclavier. I thought the whole album was pretty consistent, but a couple of my personal favorites on here are Pull Out the Pin, Sat in Your Lap, and All the Love. I particularly like the piano part in All the Love. Kate has such an amazing sense of harmony, and I think that this song is a perfect example of that. So all in all, I think it's a very good album, and it's hard for me to say if I like it more or less than Never Forever. I think they are both very strong in their own ways, but are also very different, and I think this is a nice change of pace from her first three albums, and because she recorded this on her own, I think it offers the listener a different side to Kate Bush that we hadn't really been exposed to yet. So, great album. I will give this one the same score that I gave Never Forever. I'll do an 8.5. Alright, now we have the second studio album by British shoegaze band Ride from 1992, titled Going Blank Again. This is the follow-up to their debut album Nowhere from 1990, which is often regarded as one of the best shoegaze albums of all time. I do enjoy it, but I don't think that I am as crazy about it as some other people. It definitely wouldn't make my top 10 shoegaze albums, but I do think that it is very strong. And I was happy to say that I actually think I enjoyed this one even more than Nowhere. This one had a lot more standout tracks to me, and I thought it had a very good blend between different moods from song to song. The vocal work was incredible, the harmonies were beautiful and very tight, the production was top notch, another amazing production job from Alan Moulder. And in general, I just feel like this album was a little bit more engaging and exciting than Nowhere. I do need to give Nowhere a few more listens and see if it changes, but I did find myself being much more engaged initially with this album in comparison. My favorite song on here is Cool Your Boots, and two other standout tracks for me are Leave Them All Behind and Twisterella. So a very good album and a slight improvement upon the first release in my opinion, so I will give this an 8.5. Next we have the fourth studio album from American rock band the Beau Brummels from 1967 titled Triangle. This was a recommendation left in the comments, and I had never heard of these guys, but when I saw the personnel on this album, I immediately became intrigued, seeing that it featured a lot of musicians who had worked with Brian Wilson, such as Carol Kaye, Van Dyke Parks, and Jim Gordon, among many others. But I think also because of that, I set my standards a little too high going into it, and I was expecting some sort of experimental blowout record similar to Pet Sounds. Not to say that this album doesn't have its experimental elements, because it certainly does, but there's definitely more of a folk and country element to some of these tracks, which didn't resonate with me as much. The album does have a handful of tracks that I'm not crazy about, such as Are You Happy?, The Keeper of Time, And I've Seen Her, and Old Kentucky Home. And I also wasn't always the biggest fan of the singer's voice. Usually I'm pretty open when it comes to vocalists, but every once in a while there's a band where I just have a bit of a hard time with the singer, and this was one of those times for me. But in spite of everything that I just said, there still are some really interesting tracks on here that I did enjoy a lot, and it does have some really great psychedelic tracks that are very unique musically. A couple of my favorites on here are The Wolf of Velvet Fortune, Magic Hollow, and Only Dreaming Now. So I know this is considered a classic album that a lot of people love, but unfortunately, like I said, there was a chunk of this album that just didn't really do much for me, mostly within that folk and country realm. But I do think that the good songs on here are very strong and do redeem a lot of this album for me, so I think I will give this one a 7. Alright, next we have the debut album from English poet, painter, and musician June Kramer, also known as Lady June, from 1974, titled Lady June's Linguistic Leprosy. This was another recommendation left in the comments, and for anybody who has been following Robert Wyatt and knows his story, when Robert Wyatt had fallen out of the window at a party and became paralyzed, it was actually at Lady June's house. It was her party, and she was very active within that Canterbury scene. So I was very intrigued as to what I was going to hear, and this album did not disappoint. This was some of the most interesting stuff that I had heard in a long time, and to think that this came out in 1974 is really amazing. We have Kevin Ayers and Brian Eno playing and writing the music on this album, and the entire album was actually recorded in Kevin Ayers' living room. This album takes us through this amazing journey of so many different sounds and vocal styles between regular singing, spoken word, and lots of vocal experimentation. And taking that and combining it with Kevin Ayers and Brian Eno's unique musicianship creates this really beautiful fusion of amazing sounds coming at you from every angle. We have some beautiful piano-backed tracks like Am I?, Letter, and To Whom It May Concern. We have a couple of more rockin', feel-good tracks with Someday Silly 23 and Bars. And then we have more experimental tracks where you can really hear Brian Eno's input with tracks like Everything Is Nothing, Tunyon, Tourist, and Optimism. And one thing that I think is so interesting about Eno's contribution to this record is at this point he had only been working on his first album, Here Come the Warm Jets, which is significantly less experimental and ambient than a lot of his later works, and I feel like a lot of the stuff that he's doing on this album sounds a lot more in line with stuff that he would do later on, like on Ambient 3 or 4, which I thought was fascinating. So between that and Lady June's amazing way as a vocalist and a poet, we get this really beautifully amazing and experimental album, which I was very happy with. My favorite track on here by far is To Whom It May Concern. That song is so beautiful and puts me in such a peaceful state. A couple of other favorites are Am I and Everything Is Nothing. So amazing album and a great recommendation. I will give this one an 8.5. Alright, next we have Marvin Gaye's 14th studio album from 1976 titled I Want You. Marvin Gaye is always on point for me, so I went in with high expectations, and this certainly did not disappoint. If anything, it exceeded my expectations. This album was amazing. It was so tasteful. I just loved everything about it. Right from the sound of the opening track, I loved the production. We have Leon Ware on production, and he does a great job of getting this really massive, full, cinematic sort of sound, utilizing these beautiful string and horn sections as well as cool synthesizers, creating this really interesting fusion of different sounds. The album has 11 tracks, but 2 of them are reprises of a section on the title track, I Want You, and another one is an 80-second piece that concludes side 1. But I think they are all placed in good spots on the album, and they have enough full tracks in between them to the point where it doesn't feel like it throws off the momentum of the album at all. And I don't mind hearing that groove to I Want You coming back a couple of different times because it's such a solid section and it just grooves so hard. I think the other 8 full-length tracks on here are all amazing, and the writing is so tasteful, unique, and groovy all at the same time. My favorite track on here by far is Come Live With Me, Angel. I have not been able to stop listening to that song. I just cannot get enough of it. 2 others that really stood out to me are Since I Had You and the title track, I Want You. So amazing album. I will give this one a 9. Alright, next we have the 11th studio album from Scott Walker from 1984 titled Climate of Hunter. This was a comeback album for Scott Walker after recording 4 country albums in the 70s and not releasing anything under his own name from 1974 up until this point. So everybody was curious what sort of turn his music was going to take, and the only other thing that we had heard from him leading up to this was the final album by the Walker Brothers titled Night Flights from 1978, and the couple of tracks that Scott had composed for that album were much more experimental and much different from anything that we had heard from him in a long time. So the anticipation was there, and obviously I was very curious where it was going to go, and I thought this album was absolutely amazing. To me, it had a very specific vibe and feel for almost the entirety of it, where it's very dreamlike and spacey, and oftentimes very euphoric. I'm going to get a little theoretical here, but I don't think I've ever heard another album that uses the Lydian mode as much as this one. Almost every single song is in Lydian, which is a big reason behind that dreamlike sort of mood of the album. Scott's vocal melodies are absolutely beautiful, and the production and the instrumentation in this 80s context fits very well with the types of songs that he wrote for this album. My favorite track on here is Dealer, and a couple of other noteworthy tracks are track 6 and track 3. But I pretty much enjoyed everything on this album. So, amazing album and a great jumping off point for Scott to continue to give us more and more fascinating and beautiful albums to come. So, I will give this one a 9. Okay, next we have the debut self-titled studio album from English prog rock band Matching Mole from 1972. This was the other band that Robert Wyatt had been in prior to his solo work, in addition to Soft Machine, obviously. So anytime Robert Wyatt is involved in something, I always have pretty high expectations, and I gotta say, I was a little disappointed with this album. When I put it on, I thought the opening song was absolutely incredible. It's titled Oh Caroline, and it's a really pretty love song with Robert on the vocals. And I got really excited, and I thought that the rest of the album was going to be similar to that. But then unfortunately, with the exception of just a few songs like Signed Curtain, the album then goes much more into sort of a blend of progressive rock with experimental and avant-garde sort of flavors thrown in there, kind of similar to stuff that you would hear on Robert Wyatt's first solo album, The End of an Ear, which is another album that I do have a harder time with, and I got a lot of similar feelings listening to this one that I did when I listened to The End of an Ear. So while I do enjoy some of the progressive elements that they bring, and I also like the more pop rock elements in tracks like Oh Caroline, I do think that the styles were a little too conflicting, and I felt like the vibe of this album just felt kind of scattered. So I was a little disappointed with this one, unfortunately. I think I'm going to give this one a 6. Okay, next we have the 6th album by composer Moondog from 1971 titled Moondog 2. This was another recommendation, and I've seen this guy pop up from time to time, and I've always thought that he looked very intriguing, so I was excited to check him out, and I thought this album was awesome. Very unique stylistically. To me, it sort of sounded like mixing classical vocal music with the technology and production capabilities of 60s and 70s art rock, particularly in the wide use of different percussion instruments, and that creates a very interesting and unique sound that I hadn't heard prior to checking out this guy. Each song is centered around some sort of vocal melody and is often broken up into canons or rounds, utilizing a lot of traditional classical composition techniques and forms, and a lot of harpsichord throughout, which definitely adds to that Baroque sound. The melodies throughout the album are really beautiful and they vary widely from track to track, but I really enjoyed the entire album. It is certainly a style of music that I would have to be in a specific mood to listen to, but I'm very happy to have been turned on to this awesome piece of work and this amazing new musical figure that I can dive more into. So, great recommendation and a great album. I will give this one an 8.5. Alright, next we have an album that was released only a little bit over a week ago by Brian Wilson titled At My Piano. And anybody who's been following my channel at all knows that Brian Wilson is one of my musical heroes and the Beach Boys are one of my all-time favorite bands. So anytime Brian Wilson is doing something, I'm always extremely excited. And it's been a pretty eventful past year as a Beach Boys fan between the Feel Flows box set, the Long Promised Road documentary, and now this album. It's just, it's been so awesome to be able to get all of this new stuff to dive into. So this album features just Brian doing piano arrangements of classic Beach Boys songs. And when I initially saw the track listing, I couldn't have been happier or more excited about this. I seriously don't think he could have picked a better 15 songs to do. I was really amazed. I felt like he picked most of my favorite Beach Boys songs. And then when I listened to it, it ended up being exactly as I was hoping it would be. Just very beautiful piano arrangements of these classic Beach Boys songs. And it sounds like Brian is overdubbing at least an additional piano part on top of one another, which allows him to get some additional options in terms of how he wants to arrange these songs. They have a much more mellow nature to them, but are still very true to the essence of the originals as well. I love how he chose tracks from all different eras of the Beach Boys. It's got a handful of the classic pre-Pet Sounds hits like Don't Worry Baby, In My Room, California Girls, and The Warmth of the Sun. Then it's got a couple of Pet Sounds classics like God Only Knows, Wouldn't It Be Nice, You Still Believe in Me, and I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. It's got a great medley called Sketches of Smile, where we have multiple different piano parts from the Smile album, modulating in and out of different keys and connecting together. I really loved that track. It was just really nice to be able to hear all of these little different elements that pop up throughout that Smile album. And then we have a couple of great post-Pet Sounds tracks as well, with Surf's Up, Till I Die, Good Vibrations, and Friends, which was a very pleasant surprise and a track that I absolutely love. And then we also have a really beautiful version of Love and Mercy, which sounds a little bit more similar to the arrangement from his first solo album rather than how he typically does it live, which was nice and interesting to hear. And I've heard some people say that they don't think that Brian is actually playing on this album, like they can't picture him playing the stuff that we're hearing. And I could understand where some people are coming from, but I could never imagine somebody with the musical integrity of Brian Wilson releasing an album of somebody else playing piano and then saying that it's him. I just can't ever imagine him doing something like that or allowing that to happen. So I really have nothing but good things to say about this album. If I had to choose between an album like this or an album of new original material, I would always rather hear new stuff from Brian, but being able to hear him more on piano is a real treat, and I'm very grateful that he put out this album. I will give this one a 9. Next, we have the 6th studio album by David Bowie from 1973 titled Aladdin Sane. I'm a big David Bowie fan, and this has always been one of his albums that slipped through the cracks for me that I've been meaning to get around to. And I thought it was good, but I don't think that it lived up to the hype that I was expecting it to. For me, each side would have a couple of tracks that I really liked, but there would also be a track or two that I didn't care about that were sort of like skip over tracks for me. And that is a feeling that I definitely didn't get as much in his 2 prior releases with Ziggy Stardust and Hunky Dory. There are some glam rock elements to certain tracks on this album as well, and I don't think that resonates with me as much, but there still are very much those art rock sensibilities as well that I always look for in David Bowie. I like side 2 more than side 1. The only 2 tracks that I really like on side 1 are the title track, Aladdin Sane, and Drive-In Saturday. The other 3 just don't do much for me for whatever reason. On side 2, I really like 3 of the 5 tracks. I like Time, The Prettiest Star, and Lady Grinning Soul. But once again, the other 2 tracks just don't do much for me, so I really like 5 of the 10 tracks on this album. But the 5 that I do like, I really like. And I will say also, the production is amazing, and I really enjoy the piano work. Very unique, especially that borderline atonal stuff that's going on over Aladdin Sane. Very cool to have something that experimental over the title track of the album. So not a bad album, but I wouldn't say that I like it as much as a lot of his other releases. So I will give this one a 7. Alright, next we have Toto's 4th studio album from 1982 titled Toto 4. I know a bunch of Toto songs, and I've always known that their musicianship is exceptional, but I've never actually checked out an album of theirs, and this one seemed to pop up as a favorite of a lot of people's, so I gave it a listen, and unsurprisingly, this album was awesome. I knew a couple of the tracks already. It opens and closes with two of their most classic hits, Rosanna and Africa, and the remainder of the songs that I hadn't heard before I thought were great. Some I liked more than others, but even the ones that I wasn't as crazy about were still just so interesting musically, and I really didn't dislike any of the tracks on here. I thought it had a really nice blend of different moods and vibes, but it was all packed together in a very cohesive manner, and I love every guitar solo that Steve Lukather takes on here. For an 80s distorted guitar tone, I don't think you can get much better tone than what Steve Lukather has on this album. It's just amazing. My favorite song on here, and the one that stood out to me the most, is track 3, I Won't Make You Believe. It's a really beautiful ballad with a very adventurous harmonic movement, really amazing vocal work, and just an overall very interesting and very creative song. So great album with incredible musicianship all around on every song. I will give this one an 8.5. Next, we have the second studio album by dream pop singer Julee Cruise from 1993, titled The Voice of Love. For those of you who aren't aware, Julee Cruise's first album had a lot of music that was used on Twin Peaks. She had worked with David Lynch and Angelo Badalamenti, and they wrote music on her first album to be used for Twin Peaks, and then this second album had some tracks that were used in the Twin Peaks movie Fire Walk With Me, which is where I first heard one of these songs, and it really caught my ear. So I gave this album a listen, and I thought it was beautiful. Very similar to her first album with that spacey, euphoric dream pop aesthetic. Angelo Badalamenti writes the music, and David Lynch wrote the lyrics and also produced this album as well as her first album, which was surprising to find out. And I think he did a fantastic job on the production side. The album is filled with beautiful ambient tracks with amazing vocal work. Julee Cruise's voice is breathtaking, in my opinion, and it lends itself so nicely to this kind of dream pop environment. We also have a live track called Up in Flames, which is a song featured on Twin Peaks a lot, which was nice to hear. And I really enjoyed the entire album, but to me the highlight is really the final two tracks, Questions in a World of Blue and The Voice of Love. In my opinion, those are the two most powerful and emotional tracks on the album, particularly Questions in a World of Blue. That song is so beautiful, and The Voice of Love has such great piano work and is the perfect mellow and eerie conclusion to a very beautiful album. So I'll give this one an 8.5. Alright, next we have Lauryn Hill's debut studio album from 1998 titled The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Before anybody freaks out, I have heard this album before, but it's probably been at least 10 years. It's been a while, so I definitely needed to revisit it. And unsurprisingly, I thought it was amazing. This album was written in 1997 while Lauryn Hill was pregnant, and the pregnancy, in addition to some of her past relationships, had fueled a lot of creativity and resulted in her writing over 30 songs, which would eventually be trimmed down into this album. And it's a fairly long album. It's 77 minutes in length, but it's incredibly consistent all the way throughout with a really great fusion of hip-hop, R&B, funk, and soul. The production is top-notch, particularly the bass sound. To me, the bass is just so fat, and it has such a great attack throughout this album. And Lauryn Hill did contribute to the production on this album as well, which is very awesome. There are a couple of really great features as well, such as Carlos Santana, Mary J. Blige, and D'Angelo. The songs are packed with so many tasty hooks on tracks like Do Woo, That Thing, Superstar, I Used to Love Him, and Forgive Them Father. The rapping throughout is top-notch as well, but my favorite track on here in terms of the rapping has got to be Final Hour. There's just so many great rhymes and amazing flows all over that song. And another nice little surprise towards the end of the album is a very groovy and tasteful cover of Frankie Valli's Can't Take My Eyes Off You, which was done in a very fitting way to fit the vibe of this album. Really enjoyed that track. But yeah, just an incredibly consistent album all the way throughout with great features, great tracks, great rapping, amazing production. I'll give this one a 9.5. Alright, for our metal album this month, we are doing the fourth studio album by Black Sabbath from 1972 titled Volume 4. This album was recorded during a period of a lot of drug use within Black Sabbath, so I wasn't exactly sure what this was going to translate over to, But I thought this album was good. It was definitely kind of all over the place, but I thought it was a lot of fun. It's loaded with a lot of really tasty, heavy guitar riffs, but it also mixes it up a bit and gives us a few different sounds that we may not typically expect from a Black Sabbath album, such as their hit ballad Changes, or the ambient experimental sounds in FX, or the acoustic instrumental Laguna Sunrise. I think the album is pretty consistent, and it takes a lot of little twists and turns that really keep the listener on their toes. My favorite song on here has got to be the closing track, Under the Sun. That song just goes so hard and has so many awesome heavy guitar and bass riffs. Another noteworthy one that I really liked as well was Cornucopia. So, good album. I will give this one an 8. Okay, now we have Prince's 9th studio album from 1987 titled Sign of the Times. I've seen this album pop up a lot as one of Prince's best albums, and I've even seen some people rank it higher than Purple Rain, so I've been meaning to get around to this one, and I thought it was good, but I definitely wouldn't say that I liked it more than Purple Rain. It's a double album, and I think for me, because it's a double album, there were definitely a few tracks here and there that I wasn't crazy about, whereas with Purple Rain, I love every song from front to back. I enjoy side 1 and 2 the most on here. I think that's the most consistent part of the album. I really love how it opens up with the 3 more upbeat and dancey tracks, and then it goes into Ballad of Dorothy Parker for track 4. That placement is just so nice, and it makes that track feel so good when it comes in. For side 2, I really enjoyed Starfish and Coffee and Slow Love, a really beautiful ballad with this amazing catchy vocal melody. Probably this track and the Ballad of Dorothy Parker are my 2 favorites, and probably the only song that I dislike in these first 2 sides is the track It. I find that one kind of boring, but I really enjoy everything else on the first half. And then when we get to sides 3 and 4, it's still good, but there are a couple of more skip over tracks for me, like You Got the Look, I Could Never Take Place of Your Man, and It's Gonna Be a Beautiful Night. And I know people are going to disagree with that. I know a couple of those songs were actually singles for this record, so they're hits of his, but I just never found those songs that exciting for whatever reason compared to everything else on here. So in general, I would say it is a very good album, especially the first 2 sides, and 3 and 4 have some very strong tracks as well, but I do think the first half has better momentum to it. So not a bad album, but I definitely wouldn't say I liked it more than Purple Rain. I will give this one an 8. Okay, next we have the 3rd studio album by the Monkees from 1967 titled Headquarters. I only know a handful of songs by the Monkees, just some of their big hits, and I've never checked out an album of theirs, but this one seems to pop up as one of their best, and this is the first album that consisted of a lot of songwriting from the members of the group, and I thought this album was awesome. It was a very pleasant surprise. I was expecting much more of a poppy record, and to my surprise, I thought a lot of this album really reminded me of Rubber Soul, particularly on side 1 with the tracks You Told Me, I'll Spend My Life With You, and You Just May Be the One. And in addition to the Beatles, I also got some hints of groups like Simon and Garfunkel, America, and the Kinks. So a lot of great sounds all throughout the album and a very solid batch of tracks. Most of my favorites on here are more of the mellow tracks like Forget That Girl and Shades of Grey. I will say that I think side 1 was stronger than the second side by a little bit. There were a couple of tracks that I wasn't crazy about, but all in all, I thought the majority of this album was very good. I will give this one an 8.5. Alright, for our movie soundtrack this month, we are doing the soundtrack to The Blues Brothers from 1980. This might be surprising to some people, but I was not the biggest fan of this soundtrack. I know a lot of people are crazy about it, and it does have a couple of tracks and features that I really do enjoy, with tracks featuring Ray Charles, James Brown, and Aretha Franklin. But aside from those 3 tracks, the only other songs on here that really do anything for me are Theme from Rawhide and Peter Gunn Theme. I really like Dan Aykroyd's bass vocal parts in Rawhide. To me, that's the most unique sounding song on the soundtrack, and Peter Gunn is a classic. I've loved that song ever since I was a kid. So while this soundtrack does have a handful of good moments and some great features, I do think the majority of it is just pretty boring, and a lot of these songs just don't do anything for me. So sorry to say for Blues Brothers fans, but I'm going to give this one a 6.5. Okay, so I actually ended up doing 2 soundtracks this month. So the next one is the soundtrack to the motion picture Shaft by Isaac Hayes from 1971. This is a double album at almost 70 minutes in length, and I thought it was awesome. It was a lot different than I had anticipated. It was much more instrumental and only featured 3 vocal tracks, but I thought that was really cool because it really showcases Isaac Hayes' skills as a composer, which I was very impressed with. The instrumentals range anywhere from up-tempo groovy tracks to mid-tempo tracks to bossa novas, as well as some really mellow and soulful ballads. The instrumentation is gorgeous with a full rhythm section combined with a string section, a brass section, saxophones, flute, and vibraphone. Isaac Hayes' vocals are very sparse throughout the album, but because of that, anytime there is a vocal track, it's really satisfying and it just feels like a real treat to be able to hear. My two favorite tracks on here have got to be Early Sunday Morning and A Friend's Place. Both have such strong, beautiful melodies that are really heart-wrenching. And all in all, I think it's a very consistent soundtrack with some really beautiful instrumentals and a couple of awesome vocal songs. So I will give this one an 8.5. Okay, next we have the 7th studio album by Electric Light Orchestra from 1977 titled Out of the Blue. The only ELO albums I've ever heard are greatest hits, and I know they're awesome and I know that Jeff Lynne is a musical genius, but for whatever reason I've never checked out an ELO album, so this seemed to be like a good one to start out with, and I really enjoyed this one. Not surprising, it's a double album. This is the third double album I did this month. I think I'm going to need a break from double albums next month after this, but it's a double album with 17 tracks, about 4 to 5 songs on each side. And anytime I listen to a double album, I usually think to myself, if I come out of this enjoying almost every song on every side, then that is a very good album. And that's definitely how I felt about this. The first side was very strong. I think the 3 opening tracks are definitely one of the highlights of this album for me, with Turn to Stone, It's Over, and Sweet Talking Woman. I really love the writing and the massive sound that Jeff Lynne gets between his great production and his very unique instrumentation and arranging, particularly in his use of the violins. That's a sound that I've always found very distinct to ELO. I'm not the biggest fan of Across the Border. That's the one track that I can do without on side 1. And then on side 2, I enjoy all of the tracks with the exception of Jungle. I particularly like Starlight for side 2. And then I would say side 3 is probably my favorite part of the album and the most consistent. It's referred to as Concerto for a Rainy Day, and I really love the way the songs go into one another. I think they have a great pacing, and going through the journey that you do on the first 3 tracks and then wrapping it up with Mr. Blue Sky is like the icing on the cake to me. Then I also really enjoy side 4 with the exception of Birmingham Blues. I particularly like The Whale. I love all of the different cool production going on, and this one sort of gives me hints of Todd Rundgren around his A Wizard a True Star period, which was really nice to hear. So for a double album, I think it is overwhelmingly good. It does have like 3 or 4 tracks that I'm not crazy about, but out of 17 songs, I think that's not bad at all. So I will give this one an 8.5. Okay, and for our last album of the month, we have Color Green by Sabul Bear. This was a recommendation from a friend of mine, and I've never heard of this one, but this is a really fascinating album. It consists of songs that were recorded on a reel-to-reel tape recorder between 1970 and 1973, but nothing was ever done with them, and then years and years later, her son compiled a CD of these recordings to give to family members as presents, and he also gave it to a member of Dinosaur Jr. who ended up passing it along to the Orange Twin record label, who would release this album in 2006. So anytime I find a record that has an interesting story like this behind it, I'm always excited to check it out. And I really enjoyed this. It's very stripped down, just being vocals and nylon string guitar, with the exception of one track. And the music is just absolutely beautiful. I love her voice. The guitar parts are really unique. She has an amazing sense of melody and harmony. And the stripped down and underproduced nature of this album definitely adds to it as well. To me, it felt like a great blend of Nick Drake, Joni Mitchell, and Judy Sill. But I also thought it had elements that sounded very unique to her as well on tracks like Tonight, Softly, William, and the title track, Color Green. There really isn't any track on here that I didn't like. It's incredibly mellow and chill, so it's not something I could listen to any time, but I absolutely love it, and it put me in a very relaxed state listening to it. So I will give this one a 9. Alright, so that is it for this month. I was kind of all over the place with the scoring. I definitely think I had a few more negative reviews this month than I typically do, but that's part of the fun, you know? So thank you to everybody who listened, and thank you to everybody who has been leaving recommendations in the comments. Please keep them coming, and I will keep listening to them and letting you know my thoughts. So thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys next month. Take care.